I'm going to read an article I wrote a long time ago. To put this in perspective, this was part of a very, very large article about the mob's takeover of Hollywood in the 1940s, the studios, how they extorted the studios. But this is the groundwork. This is where it all started. Before the First World War, little Tommy Maloy, he stood just over 5 feet, but barely. He'd been a chauffeur to the labor boss Mossy Enright, but left just before Enright's murder in 1920. It was at that point that Maloy went into the movie business. He didn't take it over exactly. It's called an inheritance, which means Maloy, as tough a customer as they come, inherited the right to terrorize memberships of certain unions. In this case, it was the Projectors Union, Projectionists. He was able to do that by the untimely death of another thug named Jack Miller, who was killed when a bullet took out his right eyeball through the back of his head. Miller had in turn taken over the union, the Projectionist Union, from its first owner is the right word, a hood named Elmer Miller, who made collection rounds on his bicycle. It was Miller who formed the union by bringing in all the operators under threat of violence. Miller sold out his ownership in the union to Maloy so that he could open his own movie theater. It was more money in running a movie theater in those days. Movie theaters at one point, because there was no television and radio hadn't really become a household thing at this point, theaters were, every neighborhood had its own theater. So you could have 4 or 5 theaters within walking distance of each other. Maloy carried the formal title of business agent. Nevertheless, he controlled hiring and legally collected monthly dues, and for the most part, ruled through blackjack and Tommy guns. He had no problems about cracking a man's skull, or anyone who refused to sign up for his union, or of members who asked too many questions. Where's the money that you're collecting? What are you doing here? Any projectionists who complained about the union books being closed to new members, yet having empty bank accounts, was put out of work forever. So if a theater refused to hire Maloy's members, he burned the film first. They didn't get any films. Then he beat the theater owner, and finally he just burned the theater down. But usually he simply killed the theater owner and gave the place to a family member or a crony or one of the members of his corrupt union. Maloy was an ambitious little crook. Right after he took over the Projectionist Union, he started working with Umbrella Mike Boyle of the Electricians Union. They called him Umbrella Mike because he would collect his payoffs. He'd bring an umbrella and you'd toss your envelope into the umbrella and then he'd walk away with the money. It seems like a stupid process to me. But anyway, their goal was to corner the entire buildings trade in the city of Chicago. Unfortunately for them, they were both indicted for conspiracy by a grand jury in 1921 and charged with extorting money from builders to avoid labor troubles. I'll tell you something, in the 20s through the 30s, maybe even into the 40s, the building trades in the city were run. They were run by these big, fat Irish guys. There was about a group of about 10 of them. And they came up through the ranks, the carpenters and plumbers and so forth. And they controlled what the prices would be for building a property and so forth. They were legitimately, more or less elected to run things. And it was like a chamber of commerce, in other words. It wasn't a formal thing. You certainly didn't have to do what they told you to do. And if you didn't, you wouldn't have a house built. So Boyle refused to testify, and the judge tossed him in jail for contempt. But Boyle was paying protection for years to the very, very corrupt Governor Len Small. This guy was remarkable, who granted him a pardon. In all, Small sold 8,000 pardons in 8 years. Imagine that. And while he was governor, Tommy Maloy simply paid off the jury in his case and walked away a free man. Len Small's remarkable, yet he doesn't get much coverage. He was so corrupt. The Capones never bothered with Maloy because he was a one-man operation. He was careful not to flaunt his wealth, and because movies didn't become very big business until the later 20s. So it was assumed that Maloy was a small-timer and a business that wasn't going anywhere. It was interesting, it was fun, but it had no growth development. That's the way it was seen. However, Maloy had alliances with Capone, Moran, the Saltus gang, and other gangs to keep them from taking over his unions. He gave their men licenses and put them on payrolls to explain their incomes. To an extent, Al Capone was correct. The movie business was a racket, a small-time racket, or at least it was until the advent of sound into film changed everything. Movie theaters exploded, yet membership didn't increase in Maloy's union. So he invented a scheme that called for theater owners to hire two of his men, one to run the film and one to synchronize the sound. That worked for a while, and then Hollywood figured out a way to synchronize the sound within the film. So Maloy agreed to let go of the second man in the booth for a cash payment of $1,000 for him personally. That was cheaper. It was less expensive than paying the projectionist on the payroll. So the owner said, sure, here's your grand, get rid of the other guy. In his next ploy to raise money, Maloy issued work permits to non-union members and then closed the union to new membership completely. Do you believe this guy? When the membership had enough and stormed the Union Hall in 1924, Maloy's men diffused the situation by firing machine guns into the ceiling of the city hall. There was a Tribune reporter present, and they knew he was present, so they didn't give a damn when all this happened. The members quickly took their seats. Maloy laid out his plan for hiring non-union members as what he called day workers with a permit. Maloy explained, doesn't that defeat the whole purpose of a union? Maloy explained that since the union members paid only $3 a month in dues to the union, the permit workers would pay 10% of their paycheck back to the union, and he would reduce the regular membership dues to less than $10 every 2 months. The membership thought this is great, and they agreed to those terms. Well, he's a crook. It didn't happen that way. There were problems, of course. In 1923, Maloy was at Harrison and Wabash. It was an office there where all these labor skates, guys who made their living sucking off of unions, like Con Shea, Cornelius Shea of the Teamsters, Steve Kelleher of the Theater Janitors Union, had offices. They had these labor. I mean, think about it. The guys who swept the theater had their own union. It was just insane. Together, the three hoods. Again, we're talking about Con Shea, who was notorious. And gave the Touhy brothers their start. He financed them to go out and blow up safes, and they paid him. And he helped them with their police protection. Steve Kelleher and Maloy, the three of them, they ran a gambling parlor on the first floor beneath the offices and shared the profits among the three of them. Maloy and Kelleher had a falling out over the proceeds of the gambling. It always happens. Maloy hired an O'Banion goon named Danny McCarthy and invited Kelleher to join him and McCarthy for a drink at Tierner's Resort on Calumet and 25th, next to a theater where Maloy ran the theater. He owned it personally. When they were seated, an argument began. McCarthy drew his gun, and he just killed Kelleher right then and there at the seat. He pled self-defense. Maloy swore to it. Dozens of witnesses who worked at the theater next door, who were in the theater, also swore to it. And basically he walked away, and Maloy took his union over. Just days before Big Tim Murphy decided he wanted Maloy's union. But when Kelleher was dead, Murphy changed his mind. He thought, well, this is not a good idea because crazy Maloy's killing people who move in on him. In 1927, Pete and Frank Gusenberg, they were later killed at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. They wanted their younger brother, Henry, placed on Maloy's payroll, but he refused. He sensed that the Gusenbergs might be trying to get a guy inside his union, figure out what's going on, then muscle him out. So in retaliation, the brothers ran Henry for president of the union against Maloy. The cops were called out in droves for the election, which was very violent. 4 operators who came out from Maloy in the election had their cars pulled over the curb and they were sprayed with machine gun bullets. Eventually a compromise was reached. Henry was placed on the payroll at $175 a week, but he never had to appear at work. Right after this dust-up with the Gusenberg brothers, the owners of the theaters got together, and this is in August of 1927, and they locked out Maloy. There were hundreds and hundreds of theaters. They had a meeting, and then they locked out Maloy's union guys. So across the entire city of Chicago, and in Cook County, only 75 theaters were open, and Maloy owned a lot of those outright. Jack Miller, he was the guy, the gangster that Maloy had paid off to take over the union, ownership of the union, had organized this thing. So he wasn't an ideologue. He wanted to be the boss of bosses in that little strip of land. He wanted to represent the movie theater owners as well as the union guys. So Maloy thought about it and he said, and he went to Bugs Moran. Maloy did not have a standing army of goons. He just rented them. He had cash. So he went to Bugs Moran. Moran got the goons, and they broke the lockout, basically, by just beating people up. Joe Maloy, who was Tommy's brother, was the other way they could break any problems they had. He held a post as a city, this is his actual title, City Examiner for Licenses of the Motion Pictures Operators. Anton Cermak the mayor, who was, my God, so corrupt. He had created that at Maloy's request, that position, and gave it to Maloy's brother, because early on, Maloy had given Cermak at least $5,000 when he ran against Big Bill Thompson. In order to get an operator's license, Maloy had to give you the okay. The okay went to his brother. So nobody worked without them, basically. So if you were a projectionist, you decided to speak out about the robbery that was going on in the union money, he called his brother, and his brother yanked your license, and there were people lined up to pay for that license, that available license. You had to pay Maloy to get a license in the first place. Without that large standing army behind him, a lot of people stupidly thought Maloy was going to be easy to take out or push out of the way. There was one instance where these independent gangsters kidnapped his housemaid. She was walking up the street to go to work, and they grabbed her, and they threw her in a car and put a gun in her mouth. This is in the middle of the street, by the way, in a crowded neighborhood. And they said, give us the key to the house, and then we're going to go in and break into the safe, where he was supposed to have had $100,000 in cash, and he probably did too. So the neighbors are watching this, and they call the police, of course, and so the police show up, and the bad guys run away, and the maid walks away. They got away with the key. There was another occasion when Roger Touhy's guys, Robert Touhy's my uncle, Roger Touhy's guys, kidnapped Maloy's bodyguard, Georgie Graham. Georgie Graham had been around since the 1910s. He was a kick-around bad guy. The Touhys kidnapped him because they thought he was Maloy. They'd made a mistake. By the way, Roger was a bootlegger, yeah, but he was also a kidnapper. I mean, he would just kidnap someone on a Monday, and he'd take whatever you got, $2,000-3,000, and he released the next day. He kidnapped dentists. He kidnapped the guy who invented Avis Rent-A-Car. Whatever dawned on him to do. When I lived in Peru in the 1980s, the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, a terrorist organization, also did that. They would grab people who were, upper middle class. Anybody they can get money from. They needed money to buy guns, so they'd kidnap, dentists, doctors, undertakers, that sort of thing. It was crazy. You had to go everywhere with a bodyguard. It was just nuts. But anyway, so Roger now has to call Maloy, and he's embarrassed. He says, we accidentally kidnapped Georgie Graham. What he said was, Tommy, we got Georgie Graham. Is he worth 10 G's to you? And Maloy paused for a second, and he said, nah, Raj, he ain't worth a plug nickel to me. And Touhy had to release the bodyguard. There's nothing else he can do. Otherwise, everybody really made money with Maloy, so his life was good. He had a president of the union, this guy Thomas Reynolds, and he placed Reynolds on the payroll of Western Electric for $143 a week. That was huge money. $143 a week was really good cash. A dishwasher, as an example, made like 40 cents a day. So I mean, these guys are $143 a week, and he didn't do anything at Western Electric. He was a consultant. So you can't do that to these mega corporations. It doesn't work that way. They don't buy cops on the corner. They buy senators and congressmen, and they complain, look, do something, we're getting shaken down. The IRS, which was relatively new, just getting its muscle, put Maloy under orders from the president way up on the list, the guys who were going to slam dunk. IRS agents went and they talked to the memberships who hated Maloy, and the memberships provided them with the information they needed to nab Maloy eventually. Jacob Kaufman, he was a real union organizer, and he had tried for years to have the courts get rid of Maloy and his thugs. He wanted them tossed out of the union because they were harming working people. Maloy had warned Kaufman to back off. But he didn't. He just kept suing Maloy. And so in June of 1931, Kaufman entered into another suit against Maloy, and then he announced that he would run against Maloy in an open election. Kaufman was popular with the rank and file. That candidacy meant trouble for Maloy, because Kaufman was honest and he was going to do what he said he was going to. He wasn't going to take people's money anymore. So on the night of June 20, 1931, Kaufman heard a can fall outside his garage on Princeton Street in Chicago. He told his wife to phone the police. He walked from the house to the garage, which was just stupid. When he opened the garage door, somebody fired 6 shots into his head, killing him. Murray Humphreys was strongly suspected of being the killer for hire in that one. It had nothing to do with Capone at that point. Another dissident who had caused problems for Maloy was a 60-year-old guy, Paul Osers, O-S-E-R-S, who had bought Maloy to court several times to unseat him. In salaries, Tommy Maloy made only $300 a month. His bodyguard, Johnny O'Hare, earned $150 a week for service to the Union. He protected Maloy, that's what he did. But Oser had sent out letters to the members stating that he had proof Maloy had grafted at least $50,000 a year from the Union, and I'm sure he did. I'm sure he took even more than that. When Oser went to New York to complain to the National Union president, this guy Fred Green, Emmett Quinn and his sluggers met Oser at the train station. They beat him senseless right in front of newspaper reporters who had come to ask Oser questions. They didn't care. Just beat him senseless, knocked him to the ground. And then Maloy fined each member of the party who had gone with him $5,000 at a rate of $5 a week. Some of them, said Maloy, got families. Just to show you I ain't all business. Wow, what a great guy. So in other words, it was a $5,000 penalty for going to New York to complain about the Union, but instead of wanting the whole $5,000 up front, which they didn't have, he would take $5 a week. So I don't know what 5 into 5,000 is, but can you imagine how long they'd have to pay that guy? So after Oser entered another suit against Maloy, he and Maloy met in Judge John Patrick McGorty's chamber. McGorty was a real name in the 20s. He was a pretty good guy, good judge. Oser thought that perhaps this was the moment for truth, the moment when the judge would be forced Maloy out of the Union. But all the judge did was to encourage them to meet privately and to work out their troubles like true gentlemen. But McGorty wasn't a crook. I mean, that was and actually legally, what else could he do besides someone to meet and work it out? Maloy had no intention of talking over that or anything else. He had enough of Oser, and he decided to kill him. He called Tommy O'Hare, that's his bodyguard, to do the dirty work. O'Hare had been a dance hall operator before the First World War, and then he organized the Piano Tuners Union. Do you believe he's got a union for piano tuners? And in 1919, he became the business manager for the Chicago Federation of Musicians, another union, but was tossed out for beating up the president of the National Union. It was shortly after that O'Hara hooked up with Maloy. Oser had been summoned to the office, the Projectionist Union office, by Maloy for a peace conference, he said. Although Maloy later denied that there was an appointment to see Oser, and he said Oser simply showed up and said, "Let's work this out between us, and to hell with them lawyers." I don't think Mr. Oser actually said that. They walked into the inner office, Maloy and Oser, and Maloy said, when Oser suddenly drew his gun out of his pocket, forcing O'Hare to shoot him dead. What he left out is that when he and Maloy walked from the outer office to the inner office, O'Hare was there with the gun out of his holster and aimed and shot. O'Hara said the same thing to the police. They did find a gun next to Oser's dead body, but it was unfired, and it turned out it belonged to O'Hara anyway. Maloy disappeared after the killing, hiding out at the Congress Hotel in a suite paid for by the unions. Tubbo Gilbert, the world's richest cop, the state's attorney's chief and guest investigator, took the stand at this trial, and he pointed out Maloy was lying since he had interviewed Maloy's secretary, who said that her only words to Oser were, "Yes, Mr. Oser, you're 2:30. You're at 2:30. Please go right in." But Gilbert may have had his own plan for the union as well. Right after the shooting, Gilbert seized all of the union's records, with orders to do so from his boss, the state's attorney. Those records ended up in Frank Nitty's possession. Frank Nitty was now running them out. Remarkably, even in corrupt Chicago, A jury ruled that killing Oser was justified, simply based on the fact there was no witness to say it wasn't justified. It's remarkable. The judge, Judge Fardy, agreed. F-A-R-D-Y, by the way. Members of the jury, they were professional jury members, which they had in those days, and they were selected from a political patronage system. So it's after the trial, Frank J. Walsh, who was the coroner, issued an order forever banning the 6 jurors from ever serving on the jury again. The murder is what brought around the tax people even more than before, and a revolt of the membership to get Maloy out of the union really took steam this time. On January 1, 1933, Maloy's members of his union lost a court battle to have Maloy and his thugs tossed out of the union by having 1932 election results overturned, and to have Maloy account for his $230,000 in missing fees, union fees. $230,000 in 1933. The membership was shocked when the judge refused to grant a restraining order against Maloy, coming after the members who had sued him because the membership had not proven Maloy to be a threat against them or anyone else. Do you believe this? 11 days after adopting his nephew on March 25, 1933, Ralph O'Hare, the 37-year-old, quote, organizer for Maloy, was shot and killed in an office by rebel fractions of the Union in the afternoon as he sat in a room at 620, office 620 at 596 South Wabash Avenue. Maloy was losing his grip. Now his muscle hair is gone. He knew that if he wanted to retain control, he would have to turn to the syndicate for help. It was that simple. Frank Nitti had known Maloy for years. In 1934, Maloy called Nitti and asked for 2 favors. Maloy was a man of respect, and he had nerve, and he had guts, and he was tough. So Nitti listened to him. Maloy said the Treasury Department was all over him for tax evasion. They say he owed $81,000 in back taxes for 1 year, and it looked like he was going to jail. Maloy needed Nitti to influence, to use the influence he had built up within the Treasury Department to have the case thrown off the books. Well, Nitti had no pull within the U.S. Treasury Department. But Maloy miscalculated. Maloy said he also wanted Nitti and the organization to back him for the presidency of the IATSE, which was a huge projectionist thing for theaters, and Maloy wanted the vice presidency, and then he'd control the projectionists on a nationwide thing. Maloy never figured that Nitti would double cross him, but he did. Nitti told Maloy he'd have to think it over, even though he knew he had no pull on a national level with the National Union. And George Brown, who had been a pimp originally, an extortionist in Chicago, had already approached Nitti about having Nitti back in for the job. So he was convinced that he had a deal. Maloy was convinced he had a deal with Nitti. Then November 1934, it looked like Tommy Maloy would walk away from the tax case. It looked like he had worked out a deal by turning over Billy Skidmore, an independent gambler and a bagman for the mob. He had turned him over to the IRS in exchange for his own freedom, gave him details of where he collected. They followed him around, kept track of it. That was a problem for Nitti because, among other things, Skidmore was one of his guys. The other thing is he thought Maloy was going to jail and it was just free pickings of the Union after that. And he went to Maloy and said, look, regardless, maybe it's time you leave. Maloy said, no, I'm not going without a fight, and too bad. On Christmas Eve 1934, Nitti held a party. It was a working party for the office top guys, and he invited Brown and Beoff, the 2 guys who eventually they were pimps, extortionists, really low-level guys. They had started shaking down movie theaters. So what they would do is they'd go to a movie theater and they'd say, let's say it was a huge hit film, and they said, well, if you want the movie to go on tonight, because you had to buy tickets in advance, you see, it wasn't like today you can just go up and buy tickets. If you want the show to go on tonight, give me $100, and I won't throw stink bugs in the place, I won't throw a stink bomb in the place, I won't put cockroaches in the place. Let me know. And he did. It worked. It was stupid, but it worked. Brown and Beoff, and anybody who had ears, knew what Nitti said when he started asking how to get control of Maloy's union. I mean, in other words, Maloy was expendable. He was a dead man. They met again at Harry Hochstein's house in Riverside. Hochstein is a really interesting guy. He was arrested at the train station in Chicago on going to Florida the day before Anton Cermak was shot. And he was seen in Florida, in Miami, when Anton Cermak was there, when he was shot. Hochstein, he was a political leader of the 20th Ward, and he owed everything to Frankie Rio, Capone's bodyguard, Al Capone's bodyguard. Also present at the dinner was Charlie Fischetti, Frank Rio, Frank Nitti, Paul Rica. This is the dinner they're having to discuss what to do with the union. So after the meal, they're puffing on gigantic Cuban cigars. Nitti mentions Tommy Maloy's union, and he said that they should take it over whenever possible. Beoff reported later that there was silence at the table. They all knew Maloy, all those guys, and they liked him. But according to Beoff, Frankie Rio turned to Nitti and he said, "Will Maloy stand for partners moving in on him?" Nitti said, "Not Maloy." Rica said, "Can we scare him?" Nitti answered, "Not at all." There was another long pause, according to Beoff, and Nitti broke it and said, "We really ought to have the projectionist." Rio said, "I'll take care of it right away, right after the first of the year." 2 months later, February 4, 1935, it was a bitter cold day in Chicago, ice all over the place. Maloy is, of course, speeding down the street with Doc Quinlan, who was a dentist, renowned union racketeer, all-around bad guy. They were on the way to visit Maloy's mistress, who had been keeping, for the past 2 years, a beautiful chorus girl. They'd been keeping her with union funds. As they pulled Maloy's Cadillac in front of a deserted building where the Century of Progress exhibition would be